Hello, hi everyone. Greeting and warm welcome to the public lecture series, speaker series 4 from DMU, the D Montfort University. I'm Shubhashni, privileged to be a part of Research Center, Integrated Sustainability and Urban Creativity, ISUC Center. And I'm honored to take on the role of today's event moderator. Okay, as we embark on this enlightening journey, allow me to initiate by introducing the highly knowledgeable and distinguished speaker of the day, Professor Edward Cartwright. Professor Edward Cartwright, renowned for his role as a professor of economics at De Montfort University, United Kingdom, and as the director overseeing the Institute of Applied Economic and Social Value, boasts a rich array of research interests. Noteworthy among his achievements are authorship of two prominent textbooks, one delving into realm of behavioral economic and the other focusing on microeconomic and behavior. Among its recent undertaking are notable projects such as Ramses and Emphasis. Moreover, his efforts have extended to collaborating with the East Midlands Chamber of Commerce, aiding in the establishment of regional business intelligence unit and a collective intelligence skill unit. Professor Edward Cartwright is poised to deliver an enlightening lecture on the using data to inform progress towards sustainability goal. As we know, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal (SDG) encompass a diverse array of objectives encapsulated within 17 distinct goals. These objectives represent ambitious aims that span across countries, regions, regardless of income level, striving for achievement like attaining full and meaningful employment as well as equitable labor conditions for all individuals encompassing youth, those with disability. Within this session, Professor Edward Cartwright will delve into the realm of utilizing data analysis as a means to monitor progress in pursuit of these targets. Additionally, he will conduct a critical assessment on the execution of SDG. Professor Edward Cartwright will elucidate his methodology and subsequently welcome questions and dialogues during a Q&A session. Without any further ado, let's warmly welcome Professor Edward Cartwright to the platform. Ladies and gentlemen, I now hand over the stage to Professor Edward Cartwright, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Subhasini, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, good morning from here. Good afternoon to everyone out there. So, I mean, you've seen the title of the talk, and I thought to start us off, I'd kind of just give a bit of background, in a sense, on where I wanted to go with this session. So, here's just some of the news that's hot in the UK at the moment. And I think in many ways it's been something of a watershed moment in the UK and in Europe over the summer, where there seems to be a definitive sense that climate change is happening and it's having real consequences, and we need to do something about it. Now, you might argue that we should have had that moment 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but I think this summer seems to have been something of a wake-up moment. And yeah, I've just splattered some pictures on the board of news that we have over here in Europe. So wildfires in Greece, Spain, Portugal have attracted a lot of attention. Then issues we have in the UK, well, in Europe more generally, and the world is migration issues. Now, this has become a very politicised and kind of big issue in the UK, particularly in the recent year, about migration flows and how we deal with migration flows. And then we also have a kind of cost of living crisis and rising levels of poverty, and the question of how we're going to deal with that. And I think there's a kind of a wake-up moment that, well, things just don't seem to be going the right direction here, right? On climate, things are not going in the right direction. We can see that they're, the visible signs of climate change now in our everyday life. But also on a social and a political side, things are maybe not on the nice upward trend to prosperity that we might like to see. And then the middle chart, in many ways, is I think the most interesting and the most alarming. I mean, there are lots of charts doing the rounds at the moment around climate change and measuring the impact of climate change. Now, this particular one is about the temperature of the oceans. Some of you may have seen it, some not, but it's basically showing the average temperature in the oceans of the world over time, and the kind of the squiggly lines in the middle are all the previous years for the last, 40 to 50 years. And then the red one is obviously what's happening this year, and it's clearly alarmingly high, and unseen levels of ocean temperature, at least in human history. Now, so where do we take from all this? So we have, what I want to bring to the fore today is the issue of data and what data gives us. So that middle chart is obviously an example of data, and it tells a very specific picture that's quite hard to then kind of disagree with or argue, well, that's not happening, because there's the data and it tells that very stark picture. And while society and politicians might, wildfires, we've always had wildfires. Migration's always been an issue, and so on. Data is what allows us to then put these in context and drive a debate, an informed debate that hopefully forces action. And so what I want to chart today is the how we're using data, how we can use data, and also what data is telling us. And to kind of cut to the punchline, I think that the middle chart again illustrates what I'm going to try and argue during this lecture. That first of all, we now are getting much, much better data. We'll see there's still big gaps in the data, but we're getting much, much better data to see what's going on the planet and in society. And as I say, this middle chart is one example of that. Very stark evidence of what's happening to the planet. So we are getting more and better data to chart what's happening, and that, you might argue, is good news. The bad news, that I will argue, is what that data is tending to show us is that things are not going in the direction we would hope they would do. Not just in climate and sea temperature, but in terms of social and economic indicators as well. So now we've got the data. It's telling us that we're not progressing as much as we might like. And then there's the natural step. Well, okay, how can we do things differently? And so I'll obviously talk about that as we go through. So in terms of, have that kind of preview of where I want to go, the overview of the talk. So Subhasini in the introduction kind of set out briefly what the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are. When doing a presentation like this, one never knows exactly how much people do or do not know. So to some extent, I'm going to assume that you don't know anything about them and give a very basic introduction to them. And then explain where we are in terms of mapping progress against those goals. And then I'm going to talk about data, because if we have goals, and we'll see that we have targets for those goals and we have indicators and so on, then we need to be able to say, well, okay, are we reaching those goals or are we not? And that is where data is obviously very important to inform our understanding. So I'm going to, data is good, but then data is also quite challenging. And so I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of using data. Now, some of them relatively obvious, but they're still somewhat nuanced, like, do we have data? Is the data reliable? Is it any good? And so on. I'll also talk about some of the maybe less obvious impacts that data can have. Goodhart's law, I'll explain what that means, public choice, and so on. And so again, in the introduction, Subhasini mentioned the project we had on setting up a business intelligence unit, and I think that's one of the points of that unit was to look in the East Midlands and say, well, okay, what is the data? Can we bring it all together? Can we provide that data in a useful format? Can we interpret it and so on? And while I'm talking quite generally in this lecture, I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about is informed by the experience we had trying to do that intelligence unit. So I'll talk about the progress that we've made on tracking sustainability. In a certain sense, I've already given a hint of where I want to go with that, that yes, we're getting better at tracking it, but it's not telling us what we might like to see in terms of outcomes. Now, I'm going to focus this lecture on how we can use data to track progress. There's then a completely different side to data, which is how can we use data to then drive an economy. And I think the two are linked together, and so I will talk about that, but I'll get to that at the end, and in particular the challenge of how we can start to make more positive progress towards the goals that we have. Right, so that's the overview, and I say I will start with a beginner's guide to the SDGs. So there are 17 of the goals. I'll put up what they are on the next slide. Now, these are part of the Agenda for Sustainable Development that's adopted by the United Nations. So in essence, pretty much every country in the world has signed up to these goals, and they are goals for what we want society to look at. And I've put a quote from the UN website here, and just to flag up some words, an urgent call, right? So there's a notion we've got to be doing something now, and it's worth keeping that in mind when we look at the data. Are we doing something now? Are we behaving urgently? Global partnership, I think that's important. And then when you look at this statement and when you look at the goals more generally, they're kind of hard to disagree with at this kind of top level understanding. So ending poverty, right? But doing that alongside health, education, reducing inequality, growth, and protecting the planet and the oceans and the forests. So very important goals, but also very wide goals for society to try and achieve. And then here are the 17. These are the kind of the top level headings, and I'll put them up. People can glance through them. They start with, once again, it's very difficult to disagree with or argue against these being important. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water, and so on. I mean, just because I am an economist, I will focus primarily in my discussion on the decent work and economic growth, which is number 8. But I think the arguments very naturally extend across the SDGs, where there is nuance with economics. I will explain that as we go along. Now, it's maybe, interesting to reflect on my personal journey in terms of the SDGs, because again, I never know how much people know them or they don't know them. Probably 5 years ago, I didn't know anything really at all about the SDGs, and then you start to kind of get to know them. And at first, I've got to say, I was quite skeptical. They seemed too abstract and, in a certain sense, too obvious. And I think I struggled with the purpose of them. Then over time, I think I've learned that, no, these are actually a useful framework. And I'm now at the point where I very much value and like the framework that we get with the SDGs. And so, we're on moment whether you think the SDGs are useful or not, but in the personal journey I've gone on, I now kind of really buy into the notion. And I think another thing, I'm going to point this out a few times as I go through, but the SDGs are global goals, right? They are goals that we should all, in essence, be aiming to strive for. And I think that's really important to take that on board, because the SDGs, I think, often have a characterization as being about less developed countries or lower income countries. But it's very clear when you start to read through the goals that they apply just as much in the UK, the US, Malaysia, or anywhere else, right? Because the UK is not meeting, many of these goals either. And so it's not just about less developing countries, it's a global mapping of what we should be doing. And then you can also then take that down a notch. So, okay, as nation states signed up to these SDGs, and so naturally they have an obligation to try and achieve them, but we can break that down. So regions of a country may want to strive to the SDGs, individual organizations and individual businesses, charities, and so on, may also want to map themselves against the SDGs. So they are quite a general framework. And to illustrate that, I'm just, the SDGs are you can look at them on the website. There's it is quite a nice website, and you can kind of dig down. They're one of these things where we've got those top level headings, which are quite generic, no poverty, but then that breaks down into targets, actions, indicators, which get more and more detailed. And I think that, to me, is where the value comes. Now, I don't have space time. It's not very useful to kind of go through them in great detail here, but I just wanted to give some examples so we kind of know what we're talking about when we come to look at the data, which is the key focus of this talk. So I've zoomed in on goal 8, which is decent work and economic growth. So again, that's obviously an economist, that's an interesting one to go into. Now that has 10 or 12 targets, depending on how you count them. There are kind of 2 at the end, which are a little bit different. So I put numbers 1, 4, and 5 here just as useful indicators. So 1 is about sustaining economic growth. And you can see here, there is a focus on the least developed countries, right? So that's fine. So Obviously, different countries are in different states, and so the UK is never going to get 7% growth anytime soon. So this is naturally framed in terms of less developed countries. But then 4 and 5, I think, relevant to every country, right? And so number 4 is about improving efficiency in consumption and production and decoupling growth from environmental harm. Now that I think is an incredibly powerful target, right? That yes, we get richer, yes, we get affluent, but we're going to do that without ruining the environment any more than we've done so. That's quite challenging, but I think that's a very powerful goal that we should want to achieve. Again, we can kind of see whether we're making any progress on that. And that's, very clearly that number 4 there could be applied to any nation, could be applied to regions and organisations of this plan to get richer without harming the environment. And then the 5th one I put up there is about gender and also about equal opportunities for young people, disabilities, and so on. And again, I think this is an illustration of things that apply to all countries, all organisations, right? How can we fight against discrimination? How can we redress gender imbalances in the workplace, and so on and so forth? And I'll provide some data on that as we go along. So we've got the overall goal. They're then split into these targets, and we can all look at the targets, say, do I agree with that? Do I disagree with that? But I think most of them are ambitious. But they're the kind of things we think, that really should be happening, right? We really should be having gender balance, not harming the environment, and so on. Right, so then we're down to in essence, is the final layer of the SDGs. So we've got the goal, we've got the actions, we've got the targets, and then we have the indicators. And this is where the data now starts to kick in. So what I've done here is I've put target number 5 from the previous slide. So, it's the same words as before. By 2030, full and productive employment, no gender imbalance, no discrimination, and so on. Now, that's a great target. But how are we going to measure? How are we going to say, yes, we have achieved that target, or no, we have not achieved that target, right? So then this is where the data side kicks in. And it, at least from my point of view, then starts to get interesting, but also starts to get complicated. So the UN has put forward the 2 indicators that they are going to use to try and measure that. So the first one we have is average earnings of female and male employees, right? Occupation, age, persons with disabilities, and so on. And then the second one is the unemployment rate. So I guess the basic target is that we would have equal employment rates across different categories, and that we would have equal earnings across the different categories. Right, but I'll come back to some of these things as we go along, but even now, right, I want to point out that kind of might look fine at face value, but then we have to think, how are we going to analyse those things? Right, so average hourly earnings, that might sound pretty simple, right? Okay, average hourly earnings, but what does it mean in practice? Are we going to compare full-time workers with full-time workers? Because then at least you're kind of comparing like with like. Are we going to include part-time workers in there who often get paid different amounts? Okay, this is hourly earnings. Are we going to take in, this is the same question how much people are working, because where do we join the distinction between a full-time worker and a part-time worker, right? So do we need to look at how many hours people are working and so on? So average hourly earnings, even what do we mean by average? Do we mean median? Do we mean mean? They're very, very different when you come to look at earnings. So what do we mean by average hourly earnings, right? Economists could spend days discussing what average hourly earnings would mean. And similar with unemployment. Yeah. So there are different notions of what it is to be unemployed. You can be unemployed and searching for work, right? So that might be a pure notion of unemployment. The person wants to work but cannot get a job, so they are unemployed. You might have people who are unemployed because they don't want a job. Yeah, so they are not active in the workforce, right? And then you might have people who would like a job, but because of personal circumstances, maybe that is disability or health or childcare responsibilities or whatever, is not able to access the workforce, at least under the current system. So again, unemployment rate can mean different things. And you may get very different versions of what's happening depending on which type of unemployment rate that you choose to look at. Right, in particular, whether you want to look at unemployment or whether you want to look at engagement in the workforce. So we've got our targets, we've got our indicators, but then the indicators is where we're going to have to start thinking, what do we really mean by these? This is where it starts to become, I think, quite complex to try and actually work out in practice. Well, the beauty of, at least of an indicator, so we could argue, at least, one could argue with all of these indicators, well, exactly what does that mean? Exactly how are we going to measure it? I think with all things, these, kind of indicators that are dreamt up by politicians and kind of civil servants that kind of make sense, maybe there's deliberately a little bit of ambiguity in them. And then, you have the practical statisticians, economists, and so on who have to make sense of them. But, fine, let's, assume that we can come up with some agreement on how to measure them. Then what are we going to do in practice? Now, the chart on the left here, the kind of the traffic light color coding, is our current progress towards the SDGs as measured in the last UN report. So this is where they think we are. Now, at first you look at that, oh, it's a nice, colourful chart. So I know it maybe creates a positive impression because it's a nice looking chart. But then when you actually stare at it and look at it, it gives, I think, quite a depressing picture of the progress that we have. And I just want to kind of compare and contrast some different ones. I mean, it's hopefully it's a little bit small on my screen, but hopefully you can pick up these numbers. So, for instance, goal number 8, which is the one I've just been focusing on there, which is the economy and economic growth. Then there's not a single green. So we are not on track to meet any of the indicators. So the 2 indicators I've just talked about, we're not on track the targets. We're not on track to meet any of the targets that we've set in terms of the economy. And you can see that for over half of them, we are actually going backwards, right? So not only are we not achieving the target, we're actually going backwards in our ambition to reach the target. Now, that is not good news, is it really? That's kind of a bad sign. Now, COVID, obviously, if you're thinking about the economy, COVID was a big hit to the economy. So the global economy, so that may be why the figures are slightly worse by 2023, but it's still, that's not where we would want to be, right? So that's the economy. The one thing I would say about G8, just to note, is that we do have data for everything, right? The way that the economics has developed, the one thing we're quite good at is getting economic data. So the one good thing about Goal 8 and the economy is at least we're measuring everything, right? And I want to contrast that with goal number 11, if you can pick that out. Now that I think is interesting to the kind of the institute hosting this event, because that's about sustainable cities and sustainable urban environments. And there you can see over half of it is grey. So what that means, that over half of it, we don't have any data. Well, we don't have sufficient data with which to be able to say whether we're making progress or not, right? Where we do have data, again, there's some green, there's some orange, and there's some red. So you've got these different kind of scenarios. The one where we just don't have data to know what's going on. The ones where we've got lots of data, but things are not necessarily going the way that we would want them to do. And you can see there's quite a lot with no green whatsoever. So just very quickly, goal number 1 is no poverty, right? So no greens on that. Goal number 4 is education, so no greens on that. Goal number 6 is water, no greens on that. And so on. Number 13, where again there's no green, is climate change. So massive goals that we would really think we would make progress on, like no poverty, education, climate change, and so on. There's no greens at all. So I think there's then 2 things that I want to kind of zoom in on for the rest of the talk. So we've got the grey areas, which is where we just don't have data. Because who knows, maybe fantastic things are happening and we're not seeing them because of the grey data, right? So we need to be getting better data. And then the second obvious thing that stands out to me on this chart is that we're not making the progress that we would like. So what have we got on the right here? Well, it's just one example of the kind of data they're using to assess whether or not we're making targets. And I've just picked this up because it fits with what we've just been looking at. So this is the share of youth that are not in education, employment or training, right? And so it goes back to that notion of having equal opportunity and equal access, particularly in terms of gender and age. And as you can see, there's discrepancies across the board. So females much less likely to be in education, employment or training than males. And again, I think this is where one can then start saying, well, okay, the SDGs are more about less developed countries, because one might look at this and say, well, in Europe and North America, we're doing absolutely fine, so we don't need to worry about this. That's not how to interpret this graph. So yes, as you look at this graph, Europe and North America seems to be doing relatively well. But I will show you, just to prove the point, I'm going to show you a couple of charts later on that highlights the problem that we still have in Europe and North America. So they're not off the hook here. And that's why you need to have different sources of data. And that's what I'm going to talk about, because this data paints one particular picture, right? And Europe and North America might be saying, well, there you go. You see, we don't have a problem. I'm going to show you data that shows there's still a problem there as well. So there's a lot more we need to do. Right. I mean, the good thing is that we are now starting to get this data out there. So if you want to look at this, I'm going to have another chart with some data coming on. So the data I've just got is from the 2023 Sustainable Development Goals report. Jam-packed with data. There's the Sustainable Development Report 2023, and the things I'm going to show you on the next slide are from that. But then I also like initiatives like this. So the London Mayor's Office produced a report in 2021 looking at how London is doing against the SDGs. So again, it doesn't just need to be about countries and how countries are doing. And so, you know, I really like the efforts that London made in trying to do that. Right now, we can all disagree about methodologies and how they did it, but I think this is the way we need to go in terms of you know, regions, cities, organisations, at least assessing and tracking how they are doing. So let me just go straight through, just to illustrate the kind of things that are coming out of this. And you know, if you're interested in this, there are now some really nice web resources where you can get the data. You know, I'm happy to provide the links where you can get the data. You can look at it yourself. You can form your own judgment. So the one on the left is from the London report. And again, I've just focused on SDG 8, the economy one, just to give you a flavour. The one on the right is from the World Report, and it's looking at Malaysia's progress towards the SDGs. And you can see, you know, we like traffic light systems, right? Green is good, red is bad. Now, of course, the danger, and I'll talk about politics in a little while, the danger of a political organisation doing this, so the London Mayor's Office producing this report on the progress of London, is that you can tend to get more greens because of the way things are interpreted. Right, because the politicians are in control of how it's written. Now, again, I think it's a great initiative by London to do this, but then we need to maybe be somewhat sceptical in how we look at it. So, for instance, the bottom one there is the gender gap. So, again, don't imagine there's no gender gap in the UK, because there clearly is. So, it's 20, you know, well, over 21% was the gender gap in terms of pay between females and males. Right, and that's put us a green because it's not as bad as it was before. But I mean, 21%, you know, is hardly good. So again, we need to be careful how we interpret. But then, you know, they've put the raw number so we can form our own judgment. Just maybe be a little bit sceptical of the green there, because that doesn't really look like a green light of success. And that's what I quite like about how this is done on the right-hand one. So again, this is Malaysia's progress, which, so again, this is from a more independent organisation. So the colour coding is maybe slightly more reflective. And there you have the green to indicate, yeah, we're on target, and the arrow to indicate progress. So, yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. So you could be red, but making progress and so on. And again, yeah, there's not many greens. Yeah. And you can also, again, so we've got the example of London there, which I like. You can break it down by region. I'm not an expert on Malaysian geography, but you know, you maybe spot regions of interest to you, and you can look at how regions are progressing. Now, I want to kind of get into thinking about the meat of, I've talked about some of these things, but I now want to just consolidate them and spend some time thinking about these. So the problems with data, well, can we agree how to measure things, right? Is the data available? Is it reliable? And so on. Now, average earnings. So that's one thing I've already mentioned. Average earnings can mean lots of different things. The median, the mode, the mean, they're all quite different. They're all interesting in their own way. Do we want to look at, say, the 10th percentile? In other words, the poorest people. What are the poorest people earning? Do we want that to show no gender bias? So average earnings can mean many different things. We also have to work out how to calculate average earnings. Again, there are lots of kind of nuances in that, not least how many hours someone works. Yeah, because, you know, hourly earnings is obviously, you know, the amount you earn divided by the number of hours. The number of hours that people work is often quite an abstract concept. Yeah, you're not contracted to work. Well, you might be contracted to work a specific number of hours, but then how many you actually work is very different. Again, I've talked about unemployment rate. That can mean very different things. Does it mean participation in the workforce? Does it mean actively seeking work and not being able to get work? Now, those are very different things. You can get very different numbers. But you see, not actively participating in the workforce can capture what we might actually think of in many cases as unemployment. And I think the one that interests economists the most over the years is growth. The world seems to have a fascination with GDP. Economists spend a lot of their time trashing GDP and saying that it's really not a good measure of what's going on in an economy. And I think as we move towards trying to get sustainability, then GDP really becomes a quite bad measure of how we're progressing. Average earnings probably a much more accurate measure, although it's then difficult to actually get those statistics. So what this chart shows here is we are getting somewhere on this. So the grey ones are where we can't agree on what we should be doing. Well, they've disappeared. Now, that doesn't mean there's still not going to be disagreement, but there's at least a consensus view of this is what we should be doing to measure, say, growth or average earnings. Then the dark blue are the ones that we've got the data for. The light blue are the ones that we don't have the data for. And so you can see that we're kind of getting more and more data. And so that's a kind of move in the positive direction, but we still always have to be asking these questions. Is that data reliable? How can we compare it from one year to another? Because if we're looking at progress, we want that comparison. That can be quite difficult. And can we compare from one country to another, one area to another? So taking average earnings as an example, how do I compare the average earnings in the UK with those in Malaysia? Right? Even if we've agreed what average earnings we're going to look at, we've then got to compare them. Well, do we want to look at purchasing power? I mean, the famous one that actually is the Big Mac index, where how many Big Macs can you buy from McDonald's with your average earnings? Now, that's considered quite nice because there are McDonald's in most countries, and that's a kind of a quite nice standard measure of this is what my earnings bring. Because exchange rates can move, can fluctuate quite wildly. And so for instance, wages in the UK have kind of gone down quite a lot on international measures because our currency has gone down. Yeah. And so there's these, comparing across countries is not easy. Now, if we don't have the data or we want better data, then how are we going to get it? And I think this is, in many ways, the most interesting slide in terms of where we might be going in the future, and we can maybe come back to these in terms of the Q&As. But we've got now exciting ways of collecting more data, but we need to think how we can do this properly. So traditionally, we've probably relied on administrative data, and that's why it's kind of at the top there. So in other words, governments have data on how much people are paid. So if only we could tap into that data, then we'd have a lot of data. Now, of course, it's very difficult to tap into that data because governments don't want us to look at it. So then there's these issues of how to access that. But we're now getting a whole range of independent ways of potentially doing this, right? So satellite imagery, web-based scraping, and so on. But also there's so much data now out there, right? Spending data, mobile phone data, and so on. So much is now done online that data could be useful. Of course, one needs to be very careful in using online data because that might miss precisely some of the target audience that we want to capture. But there's exciting ways of getting more data. And there's also the issue of citizen science, right? Getting individuals, because, okay, get all this data, we've now got tons of data, what do we do with it? So there's some nice examples of getting individual people, the mass of people, to look at data and try and make sense of it. right? So there's lots of different ways now of making data other than having to do surveys or rely on government data, which may be unreliable or change over time. Right. Now, Goodhart's law, I think this is relevant with many of the SDGs and the targets in it. So Goodhart, an economist who said, and this kind of, I think, illustrates the cynicism of economists. The moment that you make something a target, it's not a good measure anymore, right? So let me use gender pay as an illustration of that. So in the UK, over the last, I guess it's the last 10 years, there's a lot of initiatives been brought in on gender pay, and now organisations, large organisations, have to do a gender pay report, right, where they report their gender gap. And then that, of course, then leads to league tables. So we now have league tables of which organisation has the largest gender gap, which has the smallest one. Now, a lot of good can come out of that because the data is now there, right? We can't hide, oh, now there's no gender gap here because the data's there. There is a gender gap. So, for instance, in the BBC, that became quite an issue because you could see firsthand the gap in pay between males and females. So that's all good. But then once something then starts to become too important in a sense, there are then actions people might do to manipulate the measure, right? So in gender pay, for example, there's lots than it actually is, right? So we need to be very careful with the SDGs, particularly if they become more important, that countries don't start massaging the statistics or massaging policy to make the statistics look better. Now, the easiest way to overcome Goodhart's law, which the SDGs in essence encapsulate, is you have so many indicators and so many different ways of collecting data that it's very difficult for an organisation or a country to realistically manipulate them, right? And so we Hi there, apologies. I got disconnected. I'm going to ask Nicholas if he has my slides to bring us back. Okay, yeah, apologies for that. So let me get back to where I was and hope that the internet stays with us. So again, Goodhart's law, I think the key thing is to have lots of different ways of doing things. Now, getting back to problems with data, right? I think the third obvious problem with data is governments want to show that they're succeeding, yeah? And no, I understand that. That's their political remit. They want to get re-elected and so on and so forth. But let's think about this. The governments get to choose the indicators. They get to see the statistical agencies collecting the data, and they usually get first pick of interpreting the data. Yeah. And so we have to be, I think, quite careful of how that works out. And, we've had an issue in the UK where we're trying to, recently, of them opening up more oil fields in the North Sea. And, you can see the headline here. The UK's own climate advisor brands hypocrisy. And so this is where I think it's not just the data, it's how we interpret the data. and where we want to go with that data. And I think being skeptical of the stories that we're being told. And I've put up this again. This chart, the chart on the left, is doing a lot. It's getting a lot of attention in the UK at the moment, and it just brings me back to this question of how we compare across regions, right? And you know, there may be parallels in Malaysia and other areas of the world. There definitely are parallels. So what this chart does is it compares, I mean, the UK and other countries. And the basic argument is, well, the UK is doing pretty well. Yeah. So again, this is slightly influenced by exchange rates, but the UK on average is pretty much where Germany and Netherlands are, and a little bit below the US, although the US again slightly benefited by a strong dollar. Now this is what the chart is trying to do. What happens if we take London out of the UK numbers, right? If you take London out of the UK numbers, then the UK economy looks much worse than it did otherwise. Right? That doesn't happen in Germany. Right? Take Munich or whatever out of the German, it doesn't make any difference. Take Amsterdam out of Holland, it doesn't make any difference. You know, take New York out of US, it doesn't make any difference. So the UK numbers are really dominated by London. So then when we come to measure these SDGs, what are we measuring? Is it the UK as a whole we want to be hitting the SDGs, or is it parts of the country we want to be hitting the SDGs? You know, now I mean, De Montfort University in Leicester, so I put this one up. So Leicester has the lowest wages. These are wages in various cities across the UK. So Leicester has the lowest average wages of all of these cities, right? So then if we look to the UK without London is not all that wealthy. And then Leicester is the least wealthy city of all of those cities. So, you know, do we want the SDGs to be applying to countries or to regions, to cities? I think some really important questions there. And the final problem with data I wanted to highlight is that we can get too much. And I think that's, I talked about the business intelligence unit we have with the Chambers of Commerce. And I think that's one lesson that comes out of that to me is we now have loads and loads of data, right? We've seen there are gaps in the data, but we've now got tons of data, right? Mobile phone data, credit card data, just tons and tons of data. But what are we going to do with it? Yeah, you've then got this question of how can you navigate your way through that? And also communicate that data in a way that people can understand. Yeah. And that's, in a certain sense, way more difficult than just collecting the data in the first place, right? And I mean, if we go into the Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about that in a bit more detail of how we can communicate data in an effective way, in an open and transparent and informed way that then people can understand. Yeah. And so, you know, just to give you a quick example, so on the left-hand side, I've talked a lot about the gender pay gap in the UK. So we now have this wonderful data. So this is one website, it's a government website. You can go on and you can look up the gender pay gap, for instance, by types of profession. So, you know, here we have one. I've looked up economists, given that I'm an economist. So, yeah, women earn on average £20 per hour and men earn on average £23.67 per hour. So you can see that gender gap, right? But then we also need to then get much better at understanding that. So where does that gender pay gap come from, right? Because if we're going to fix it, we have to solve it. So this is a piece of work, very powerful piece of work on the right-hand side that looks at earnings over time when someone has a child, right? Again, I missed the reference off here, but I can give the reference if people are interested. So for men, you have a child, well, what difference does it make, right? Earnings, hours worked just stay exactly the same. Females, the moment they have a child, earnings drop, hours worked drop, right? So that's, you know, seems to be the picture of where the gender gap is coming in, right? It's a lot to do with childcare and childcare responsibilities. So we get the data, we then want to fix it, we need to get more data to understand it. And of course, that's what science is there to do. This is going to be an iterative process of trying to get more informed. And of course, another problem with data is what they miss. And I mean, this is the final problem I want us to talk about. But I'm just going to emphasize, particularly given time, and I need to kind of wrap up soon, is the one at the bottom there. So data isn't just numbers. The famous quote at the bottom, there are three kinds of lies: damn lies, and statistics. So, numbers, yes, they're useful, yes, they're important, but they only tell part of the story. And one thing I'm quite passionate about, in a way, is that we should also be capturing what people think, right? It's not just those numbers, because let's say we're interested in, no poverty or whatever. We can collect all the data we like, but what people tell us can also be critical in informing. And we tend to focus on numbers because they're simpler to deal with, right? It's still complex to interpret them, but they seem kind of simple to deal with. But lived experience can tell us such more. And in particular, numbers can often be missing parts of the economy. I've mentioned the informal economy here, the people that just don't show up in data, right? Their numbers are not going to tell us much about those. And then we've got the whole issue of how we interpret data. Right. So kind of wrapping up in a sense, one thing we need to think about is the role of big data. Right, so this is something we could talk about more in the Q&A. Is big data a help or a hindrance? It's a help in a sense of us having more ways to collect data. But then I do worry that we then have more of a black box in terms of how we are interpreting the data. Are we respecting ethics? Again, are we just focusing on numbers and missing important stories that people might have to tell? So big data, I think, is an opportunity, but a challenge, and that's something that we need to think about. And so I wanted to end by looking at the future. And now I think I've already said it many times during the lecture, but the evidence we have is that progress is not particularly great. And, I've put up a few charts. Here's another chart, which is, again, so these fantastic data sources now out there on the internet, and there's lots and lots of reds here, you can see, right? I've just picked up on number 8, which is the economy one here. So you can see, okay, average hourly earnings, there's some greens, right? But there's a lot of places with no data. Where we do have data, there's a lot of reds, right? It's not where we want to be. So we have that challenge going forwards. So how to address that challenge? I think we need more data, but I think it's vital that that data is open and transparent, because that allows us to overcome some of these political issues of which data, how to interpret the data. If everyone can see the data, then it's easier for us to draw our own conclusions. But we also need to recognize that there's a real lack of progress in us getting to where we wanted to be in terms of the SDGs, right? And so political will is needed, And I think if there's one takeaway from my talk, it would be what I've written in bold there. We're getting now lots of data to monitor the SDGs, right? And that's fantastic, and it has been a huge step forward. But the data we're getting tells us we're not really making much progress towards the SDGs. So now we've got to go that next step, which is, of course, the hardest step. We say, well, okay, now we have the data. We can't hide from this, right? What are we going to actually do to act? And I mean, if you're interested, the one on the picture on the right there is we have an issue in the UK. So just go back. We have an issue in the UK at the moment of water quality, right? And sewage leaks into water, which has hit the headlines a lot during the summer. So we need political will to solve these kinds of things. But we also need individual action, right? And we need to think as a society how we want the future to look, right? And are the targets the right one? Are the indicators the right one? What matters to us? What is most important to society? We have a very consumption-driven economy. Is that what we want, right? How can we harness digital technology? A particular interest of mine, we've got a project going on about this, is smart cities and how you can use technology to redress and not exasperate inequalities, right? To solve problems and to not make them worse, right? So I think the SDGs provide us this framework to maybe think, how are we going to do things differently to get progress? Right, so I'm going to wrap up, hopefully on time, with just a couple of takeaways. So yeah, data is transforming our understanding of sustainable development goals. That's the good thing. But the bad news, it's taught us how far away we are from achieving them. Yeah, and in many places we're actually going backwards. Right. So let's collect more data, right? But let's think, and let's have open, transparent data so that we get a real picture of what's going on. But monitoring's the easy bit, right? The much deeper question is how we're going to get that behavior change so that we can have a sustainable growth in the future. Right, so with that, I will pass back to Subsini. You're on mute. Yep.
Okay, I'm very sorry about that. Didn't realize that. Okay, so anyhow, thank you, Professor Edward Cartwright, for such an insightful sharing. In connection with today's lecture, I have something to share regarding unleashing the potential of data for sustainable development. Moving forward with Cape Town as the starting point. The United Nations World Data Forum, held in January 2017 in Cape Town, South Africa, catalyzed the initiation of various interconnected endeavors. It additionally furnished a platform for the introduction and examination of Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development Data. This plan was collaboratively crafted and by constitution of official statistical framework along with other data-oriented communities encompassing civil society and private sector and academia. Subsequently, it secured an endorsement during the 48th session of the United Nations Statistical Commission. The blueprint provides a strategic roadmap for structuring and executing country-centered statistical capacity enhancement. Within this framework, 6 pivotal domains for action has been delineated. Okay, with that being said, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce the commencement of Q&A session, and Professor Edward Cartwright will be addressing them. So, Professor, okay, so the first question was from Miss Pearl, okay, and she would like to know, how does the organization communicate its sustainability progress to the public, investor, and other stakeholders?
I think it's a very complex, multifaceted question. So I think you've got the how they do it, but I think the why they do it is also important. There is a lot of what we call climate washing. We call it climate washing in the UK. I don't know whether that term's used there, but organisations wanting to project that they are being sustainable and going towards net zero and wanting to say all these things, whereas maybe behind the scenes things are not the progress is not being made, and things like carbon offsetting. So a lot of organisations now carbon offsetting, but carbon offsetting is a very, I think, quite controversial issue in the sense that is it actually really carbon offsetting, or is it just a nice kind of tick box so that the organisation can say they're doing things? And so I think there are some organisations that are genuinely taking this seriously and doing very good things. I think there's some organisations that want to look as though they're doing it seriously and maybe they aren't. And then there's some organisations obviously just not taking it seriously at all. And again, we can unpick why that is, right? So, for instance, investors, frankly, might not care if the organisation is sustainable because they want the dividends, they want the return on their investment, and so do they care? So we've also got to look at the different stakeholders and whether they're involved in this. So I think there's an awful lot to unpick in that question. I think if it's an organisation that's remotely large in society, I think the more that independent organisations can assess progress, I think that is the way to go here. Now, there are limits to that to some extent. So, for instance, the gender pay that I've talked about in the UK. So every large organisation has to produce a report outlining their gender pay gap. They have to have a report on the supply chains and the slavery, modern slavery, and things like this. So regulations to do, but we just have to take that data at face value, which is something of a leap of faith. So I think the more that we can have independent organisations looking at these things, then that to me is the best way of doing it. But then we've kind of talked about this in our team before when we've been looking at things. You don't necessarily want to start naming and shaming organisations and not doing things. I think this has to be driven by positive narratives of organisations that are doing good things, because naming and shaming doesn't necessarily work very well. Yeah, so I'm not sure I've answered the question, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Professor Edward. Okay, the second question is from Dr. Stephen Poon. He likes to know which data is truly to be the most correct to achieve certain goals.
I think it's. I think that is the tough, because each goal has these targets, and each target has its indicators. I think for each target you could have an entire conference of people arguing over what's the best data to assess that. So if I look at some of the economic ones, as I've discussed, you could argue over, well, what's the right definition? What's the best way to look at it? And so I think you'd find a lot of disagreement on these kinds of issues. So I think we always need to constantly take a step back and say, well, what are we trying to achieve with this? So, for instance, if we're looking at wage data, right, we can get very obsessed with the nuances of how we're collecting wage data and whatever. But take a step back. What are we trying to do? We're trying to understand if there's equal pay for females and males, or if there's poverty in Leicester compared to another city in the UK. So I think we need to keep our eye on what it is we're trying to measure, and then more likely to find the right data. But I think my answer to the question would be we need lots and lots of data, lots of different ways of doing it, lots of methodology. So again, if our interest is, say, the gender gap, male versus female pay, let's have lots of measures. Then if they all give the same answer, Well, then that's fine. If they give different answers, then we have to have an argument and we have to have a debate. But we can have that. So I would say the answer is lots of measures. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Edward Cartwright. The third question was from Mr. Sai. He likes to know about what technologies are commonly assigned to collect and analyze data related to sustainability targets.
I think the main way of doing this in the past has been survey data and government administrative data, which is why the economy is the one that is quite well measured, because we've been doing surveys and collecting administrative data on the economy for a long while. But I think it's clear we need to be doing better than that. You know, surveys are fine, but they have biases, missing data and so on. Government data is fine, but access is an issue. So I think more and more technology. I think sensors and cheap sensors. So I talked about water quality very briefly at the end, right, which is an issue in the UK. So more water quality monitoring, right? In the old days, that was maybe someone going out of the office, collecting water. It's time consuming. Now we can use more and more technology to collect water quality data in real time. I think at the moment, the SDGs is more, okay, what data do we have out there that we can use? And I think if we can turn that around and say, well, this is what we want to measure, what technology can we use to measure that? I think that might be a step forward in terms of monitoring, because it's you know, I had the slide saying, oh, there's all these technologies out there, you know, AI, big data, whatever. To be honest, we're not using much of that yet. So it's an untapped. So the answer to the question, what technologies are we commonly using, is probably not as much as we should be. So I think that's an untapped area at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Professor Edward Cartwright. Okay, the next question is, what ethical considerations are taken into account when collecting and utilizing data related sustainability, particularly concerning data privacy and potential unintended consequences? By Mr. Koo Lei Young.
Yeah, I think this is really important. So I think consent and privacy of data is absolutely critical, because, okay, so we can argue that we now have all this data, like mobile phone data and so on, but you know, we need to respect, particularly as researchers or as government agencies, we need to respect data privacy, and that needs to be foremost. So I think it's an issue of, and to me that goes back to maybe the question of what exactly do we want to use this for. So again, there's a lot of talk now, we have kind of mobile phone data, right? Okay, well, why is that mobile phone data useful, right? And maybe if we could track down exactly what it is we want to do with that data, we can then kind of go through the ethical minefield of trying to pick out the data that we need. So for instance, I don't know, maybe what we want to do is we want to look at how people travel through the day. We want to look at commuting, which then might tell us about, you know, journey times, pollution, things like that, right? So maybe picking out the bits of the data that's useful to us. And then, but yeah, I think as a researcher point of view, it's very clear that the ethics needs to come first, rather than just having great big data sets, banging around and then causing unintended consequences.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, the next question is from Mr. Koo. Okay, how frequently is data collected and analyzed to assess sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the answer is, I think, not enough. So I think when we look at UK data, and the UK in principle is supposed to be quite good at this, but there's so many things in the UK, like the economy, you look at, and the data's 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. So we have a census in the UK that gives us a wealth of data, but it's every 10 years, right? So at the moment we're kind of fine because there was one recently, but often you're having to go back 10 years to find out what's happening. With survey data, government survey data, it can be 1, 2, 3 years before the data comes out, and then you pass. So not enough. I think if we could have more real-time monitoring. So I think on the climate, at least, we're now getting much more real-time monitoring, which is obviously fantastic. But I think on economic and social measures, we're still lagging well behind. And I mean, when you're looking at data on economic and social indicators, I think it's always worth checking the year, because sometimes the data can be very old. And pre-COVID, for instance, at the moment, and you might think, well, is that really telling you what's happening now?
Okay, thank you, Prof. I think this will be our last question for today. Okay, is from Miss Cynthia Paul. Okay, the question is, could you elaborate on the integration of qualitative data such as social impact assessment or quantitative stakeholder feedback into data-driven sustainability assumed process?
So I'm not so familiar with the second half of that question, but in terms of the first half of the question, the integrating qualitative data, I think it is difficult to do. I think the way that science has evolved, we like quantitative data. So even when we get qualitative data, we try and convert it into quantitative data through some textual analysis or something. And to me, I would advocate maybe a slightly more holistic approach. So again, what are we trying to achieve? Right. So, okay, we've got all this quantitative data that's telling us one thing, right? Let's go out and talk to people, right? Let's get feedback. Let's get qualitative data and get a sense of whether that is telling us the same story as the quantitative data is, right? And I think that to me, if multiple sources of data are giving you the same picture, then okay. But if multiple sources of data are conflicting, then I think that's the question that I would say. I'm just reading the next question because I think it's a follow-on from that question. Do you want to read out the question? Or?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Edward Cartwright. That was our last question for today. Anyhow, this concludes today's lecture series. We eagerly anticipate the opportunity to gather once again for the upcoming lecture series. We extend our gratitude to Professor Edward Cartwright for the insightful response. Okay, we trust that his answer has proven valuable and enlightening for all of us as we chart our path forward. Thank you, Professor Edward Cartwright.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you for joining our lecture series 4. We will be seeing you all soon. Thank you.